Hi, this is John again, the owner and developer of VectorDecks. In this tutorial we're going to go over the lattice option, a lattice skirt that sometimes your clients want to cover up the bottom portion of the sun deck and they'd like to know how it looks with any kind of lattice or covering. I made this very simple. There's no drawing involved. You don't have to click and drag and draw any lines where the lattice goes. Just select the deck frame and go into the Object Information palette. See here a button that says Draw Lattice. That's all that's involved. Just go ahead and click on that and you'll see it'll re-render and it'll draw a lattice skirt completely around the outer edge of the deck. Even around the steps, because the steps use deck info is turned on. Even though this is a very simple operation by clicking one button, it's still going to give you a tremendous amount of power of what the lattice will actually look like. And that power is going to be in the Sun Deck Settings button. So go ahead and click on that. And then you'll see that option for lattice. Select that. You'll be presented with this window with a couple of views of how your lattice is constructed. This is a top section view of the construction of the lattice around the deck. Now this is not the actual lattice as it's shown on the deck as far as how much is drawn in here. I wouldn't have room to put the entire deck if this was a large deck in this small window. So I made an example of the construction of the lattice, and then I rendered a sort of a front view of this example. Over here you're going to see where you have these options and controls of how that lattice is going to actually appear on that sun deck. Changes made in here will be updated in these views. The first thing you notice, deck has lattice button is checked by default. This won't be checked. This will be turned off if you had that draw deck lattice button clicked off on that object information palette. But you had it clicked on, so when you launch this window it was turned on. If it's off, you won't have the controls over how that lattice looks. Now in the first option you'll see you have, and that's going to be the actual appearance of the lattice itself. I have just a couple of different styles here. The one that's in there is diamond white. Let's change that to a square white, and you'll see it got updated here. Now there'll be more different styles added and patterns added. For now I just showed those two. And the next, you have the control over the thickness of the lattice. It's set 1/2 by default. Let's go ahead and make that 1/4 of an inch, and you'll see it got updated to a 1/4 of an inch here. And next we are going to work with the actual corner trims. The corner trims are going to be any point where your lattice sheet will stop and start again with respect to a change of direction. But you'll generally want to put a corner trim pattern that may be different than any interior trim. You have the controls over the actual color of that. Set it by default white, but you can make it, let's say, pressure treated, and you'll see it gets updated. We can update all the different kind of textures and finishes to the trim in this window. And then the corner trim itself, by default it says 1x4. You can make it whatever you'd like, define sizes, or you can custom size. I in fact use this a lot because I'll be ripping sometimes materials to be used for these corners rather than just the standard stock. And then you can enter the actual custom sizes in here, and it'll update up there. Let's keep that at 1x4. And then inside trim is basically the same thing. It's going to give you the options of predefines or custom. If you select custom, you can change it to any custom size. And it's going to default to the color and the finish of the trim setting. So if this is white, then your inside trim will also be white. At the bottom here though, you'll see where you have a setting where you can make inside trim maximum on center. That you can change if you want to have more panel look to the deck or less. You can make the change here. It gets updated up top. For example, I'm going to change this to 48 and apply the change. And you'll see this changes to 48, but the picture itself is going to basically just giving you sort of the specs on the appearance of the construction of the lattice. Now when I clicked on that apply, it doesn't apply it to the deck surface or your drawing document. It's just going to apply it to the settings here. And once you're satisfied with everything here, the controls over how everything looks, you can click OK, or you can cancel out, which will assign everything back to its default. But we're going to go ahead and click OK. And you see here the lattice changed to those square openings instead of the diamond shape. So you see it was simple enough to draw. It didn't require any drawing at all. It just required a click of one button to draw a lattice, and then you have the controls over the appearance. But you're also going to have the control over which edges of the deck actually have that lattice in the setting instead of the lattice setting. Click on Deck Edges. You're going to see all the edges of the deck are defined by these numbers. L is for lattice. Currently we have the back portion turned off, both the lattice and the fascia, because this is up against the house. But if you ever wanted to make any other changes, for example, let's say if the house was wrapped around here and you didn't need any lattice or fascia in this section, we'll go ahead and turn that off. And turn off that lattice. It'll tell you here what's turned off. I'll even, just for the sake so you can see it on the rendering, I'm going to turn this front edge off too. Let's turn that. Let's leave the fascia on, just turn off the lattice. Then when you click on OK, you're going to see it'll re-render itself, but this panel will be missing. See how it left that opening, and also the back panel. Now, in a lot of cases, you won't need to do anything with this, basically because lattice is generally going to go around the whole area of the deck. But in future upgrades to my VectorDecks plugin sets, I'm going to be making a fairly extensive material list. And that's where you probably want to have a lot of control over what is going to actually be where, because it's going to involve materials in those different locations. And also I'd like to give the customer a rendering of exactly what they're going to actually have. Now the lattice area of the steps won't have those edge controls. It's going to draw the lattice all the way around the edge of the step. Those controls will appear in the step setup button instead of the deck frame setup. Now there's one other thing I did here that involves the lattice, but there's no settings and there's no extra buttons to have to click that's involved in this. And that's really the relationship the lattice has with the beams. If you've ever designed the sun deck and it didn't have lattice, but the beams were trimmed out, I turned that lattice off, and I'm going to go in here and turn the beams and get them trimmed out. Trim the beam in post. Let's put a cap on both those. And I'm going to leave it a pressure treated just to show you this example. It'll extend out a little bit farther because the trim on the beam actually finishes all the way to the outside face of the fascia. But what I was doing in the past is when I would click on that draw lattice, it would have the beams extend or penetrate through the lattice screen. It wasn't a real problem. I'd have to go back then and just turn off the trim, but I incorporated that within a plugin. When you have a trimmed in beam situation and you click on lattice, it's going to automatically drop the trimming from the beams. See, I show here it's just a basic frame beam, post and beam that's no longer trimmed. Also, because it's not going to be seen, in most cases you don't want to spend all that money and time trimming the beams and then covering the whole thing with just a lattice screen. It also will affect the total materials involved because you don't have to have all the trimming on the beam. Now if you ever want to go and turn that lattice off at this point, it's still going to keep the beam defaulted to no trim. You'd have to go back in and turn that trimming back on. That's pretty much it with the lattice options. It's very simple. It just involves a click to draw. It's going to give you a lot of edit capabilities in the button menus to how it looks and the different styles and different finishes.